If you have your Bibles, please turn to the book of 1 Kings. And today we're in chapter 18, finishing up chapter 18, looking at verses 41 through 46. As we continue to look at the life of Elijah, or the ministry, I should say, of Elijah, that nobody from nowhere who had just won the victory of his life and ministry in the passage we looked at last week. Against all odds, he showed that Yahweh is the one true God against the Baals and showed that they were fake in a public showdown, the high point of his ministry. But first, let's do a little background on that. Israel had split after King Solomon. The nation of Israel split in two, north and the south. The north was called Israel, the south was called Judah. The north set up their own places of worship because they didn't want their people to go down to Jerusalem where the temple was. They built their own place of worship. Instead of having a temple like the tabernacle with the Holy of Holies and the holy place, they had golden calves, which means they were mixing the religion of Yahweh in with the pagan religions of the area of that day. They did not have Levites for their priests. They had their own priests that did this. They did not have kings in the line of David. They didn't want people to go to Jerusalem and worship. They basically didn't just split from the southern kingdom of Judah. They split from God. They split from Yahweh. And king after king, it got worse and worse and worse until the rock bottom was the reign of Ahab, where we are in Elijah's day. Ahab and his bride Jezebel, who was a princess of the king and high priest of Baal of Sidon, who was one of those domineering wives that wanted to ram everything through, and what she wanted to take care of was completely getting Yahweh worship out of the land. So all the priests of Yahweh were killed under Ahab and Jezebel, or at least all of them they thought they killed. We found out a few weeks ago that some were hidden by Obadiah, 100. But sought to kill in other words, all the spokesmen for Yahweh. When you think of the prophets of Yahweh, think of pastors, even though they didn't have pastors like we do in those days. But prophets spoke for that. They were spokesmen for God, which is generally what pastors do when they preach. And so what they did was just killed them all. So basically they were wiping Yahweh worship out of the land, establishing Baal as the chief god, the Baals and the Asherahs. That's the god of thunder and rain is Baal, and the god of fertility would be the Asherahs. They were now officially the gods of Israel, if you can imagine that, under Ahab. That's how low it came. At this time, God raised up Elijah, that nobody from nowhere, and had him be the one to do this great showdown between Yahweh and the Baals. He first went to Ahab and said, "It's not going to rain until I say it rains," because Yahweh is the true God and Baal is not, which is interesting because Baal is the god of thunder and rain. Then God hid him away for 3 years as a devastating drought hit the land. It did not rain after he said that. And Elijah, as we've been following on, went through some periods of preparation. He learned to trust in God to provide for him while being hidden in the wilderness by a brook where a raven would bring him food morning and evening. Cheeseburger and fries, most likely. Raven brings in. And then after that, he provided for him through a widow as he moved him into the very land of Jezebel, near Sidon, and had a widow take care of him. And this widow took care of him because God saw to it that her jar of flour and oil never went dry throughout this drought. He learned to trust God. He learned that through him, he could do powerful things through God as he raised that widow's son from the dead. All these were learning things for Elijah, all pointing towards the big one, the showdown that we looked at last week. After 3 years of drought, he came back to Ahab and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. On Mount Carmel, get everybody, the whole nation, to come and observe this. We're going to have a showdown, me versus 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Ashtoreth against one, to see who is the true God." And they agreed to that. And everyone came out, everyone except the 400 prophets of Asherah, who ate at Jezebel's table, we're told. They were kind of her pet prophets. They didn't show up for this one. But there were 450 prophets of Baal and one Elijah. And the deal was they would cut up a cow. They would sacrifice a bull. They would build an altar, lay the meat out, and call down on their God to bring fire from heaven. And the God who did that would be the true God. So in the story we looked at last week, all those 450 prophets of Baal set up their altar. They were doing all their prayers, all their incantations, all their dancing, all their prophesying. They were even cutting themselves and bleeding. Everything they had in their bag of tricks of worship from dawn until dark. And guess what? Nothing happened. So Elijah waits until just about dark, so he doesn't have much time here. Not only sets up his altar, but douses it to where it was in standing water and prays a prayer to Yahweh, saying, show these people who the true God is. And fire comes down from heaven, not only consumes the offering, not only consumes the wood, actually burnt up all the rocks and dried up all the water, so there was nothing there. And all the people fell on their faces and said, Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. And they rounded up all the prophets of Baal, and Elijah's orders, they killed them all. The victory of his life. What he was called for, what he was sent for, was that very thing, to turn the people of Israel's hearts back to Yahweh. And that's where we pick up the passage we're looking at this morning. 1 Kings 18, beginning with verse 41 through the end of the chapter. Now Elijah said to Ahab, go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of the roar of a heavy shower. In other words, he says, okay, it's going to rain. Go have a party. By the way, they were no doubt on rations. 3 years of drought. It was bad. He says, okay, it's going to rain, so go have your party now. Verse 42, so Ahab went up to eat and drink. But Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he crouched down on the earth and placed his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, go up now, look toward the sea. So he went up and looked and said, there is nothing. And he said, go back 7 times. And it came about at the 7th time that he said, behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea. And he said, go up to Ahab and say, prepare your chariot and go down, for that the heavy shower does not stop you. In a little while the sky grew black and the clouds and the wind, and there was a heavy shower. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And then the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. So we have this tremendous victory, Yahweh versus Baal, 450 to 1, and the one was even soaking wet. A clear demonstration of the power of God. And the people proclaimed, Yahweh is the true God, and killed the prophets of Baal. Great victory. Now it's time for it to rain. Remember, it started out by him saying, it won't rain until I say it rains. That set up this whole thing. It's been 3 years. Now it's time to rain. He tells Ahab, go have a party. You can quit your rationing, just enjoy it. It's going to be raining very soon. And he goes up and crouches down with his face between his knees. Now we aren't told what he's doing, but you can really come to no other conclusion to say he's praying. Okay, he's going saying, okay, now Lord, you've been doing everything that I've done everything you asked me to do. You have provided. You've worked miraculously. You have shown that you are God. Okay, bring on the rain. And we tend to go through these verses very quickly because he didn't say to his servant, go 7 times and do this. You can read it that way and say, he said to his servant, go look 7 times. That's not how it was. He said, he's praying. He says, okay, now go check out the water for me. Now, he's on top of Carmel. We don't know how far it was to the vista where he could look out over the Mediterranean. But he wasn't sitting there where he could turn and look. He had to send a servant. The servant comes back, and there's nothing. So he prays again. He says, okay, Lord, bring that rain like you said you would. He sends the servant. He comes back. There's nothing. So he prays again. Send the servant, go look now. He goes down to that vista where he can look over the Mediterranean. He comes back and says, there's nothing. So he prays again. He says, Lord, it's worked every time. I had to pray once, and you took care of all that offering and the water and even the rocks on this mountain. Where's that water? Okay, servant, go check. He comes back, says there's nothing. So he prays again. And then he says to that servant, okay, now go check. He goes. He comes back. There's nothing. So he prays again, with his head between his knees. Says the servant, go check again. This time the servant comes back and says, there's a little wisp of a cloud, the size of a man's fist, coming up out of the sea. Elijah says, bingo. Go tell Ahab he better get on his chariot because there's going to be a monsoon coming. Head for Jezreel. Now, I say it in that way because that's what we have here. It's not just these few verses that say he told his servant 7 times, go check. This was interesting. We look at this and we ask ourselves, what is going on here? It's so easy just to pass right over these verses in the midst of this passage, but what is going on here? Why is God doing this? Why did he not pray and have that shower come? Just like he prayed once and all that offering was consumed. The interesting thing is, I've looked at commentaries over this, and there's a lot of speculation, but nobody really knows. There's some ideas. There's some would say, well, he was teaching him patience. He still needed to learn some patience because everything he'd been doing been going right. Well, that could be, but don't you think he learned some patience sitting by that brook of Cherith? And don't you think he learned some patience for a couple years with a widow in a land of Baal worship? Others say, well, maybe, he needed to be humbled a little bit because things were going pretty well for him. When he said something was going to happen, it happened. And just so that God made sure that he understood that it wasn't him doing it, it was God. And God would do it when God wanted to, not when he wanted to. That's a possibility. But it's speculation. Ultimately, we don't really know. And I think this is kind of interesting because waiting is very often a part of God's program for us, and we very seldom know why. Have you ever been in a situation where you're waiting for something to happen, it's going to happen or it should happen, and you trust God, but it's not happening? And you know what God would want you to do, and you're doing it, but you're just not seeing the results. You ever been in that waiting situation? You're not alone. Why did Abraham and Sarah have to wait till they were long past the age of bearing children to have their promised son? Why did Noah have to wait about 100 years after God said it was going to rain before it rained with that ark? No doubt the whole time being mocked by everybody that saw a guy building a boat when it had never even rained. I quote Bill Cosby on this. If you ever heard Bill Cosby's Noah, it's hilarious. At any rate, I digress. Noah had to wait. David was anointed king, and he had to wait years before that came into fruition. And during that time, he was a fugitive running for his life from Saul for a good chunk of it. Why? What was that all about? How long did Israel have to wait for their Messiah? Many Jews, by the way, are still waiting, unfortunately. Paul, when he was called to preach the gospel and went right down to Jerusalem, ready to go, had to wait about 15 years, off to Arabia, of all places, before God was ready to use him for what he had use for him. Many times we find ourselves waiting in places that we don't really want to be, waiting for God to do something, waiting for something to happen that we think should happen. And yet in those times, it is God's plan. It is his will. And we don't know. In hindsight, we can look back at almost every one of these instances I mentioned and see in hindsight, why? Well, of course, Abram and Sarah had to wait. That proved it was nothing short of a miracle of God. Of course, Noah had to wait. By the way, with no power tools, it probably took him 100 years to build that boat. God has a plan in every one of these. But when you're in the middle of it, you don't see it, and you don't know it. And there's just a little example of that right here on Mount Carmel when he goes to do something very simple. After all that he's done, praying for rain is pretty simple. And yet it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen. Now, we can use the magical number 7 and say, well, there's some significance because 7s are important in the Bible. Yeah, they are. But you know what the real significance is? He just had to wait until it was God's time. And we don't know why. But that's okay. I suspect, my thought is, Bob Satterley's thinking, it's speculative, is that he did need to learn some humility here. That he was doing some amazing things, and God wanted to make sure he understood before he went any farther that this was not his abilities, it was God, and God would do it in his time, not his. But I'm not going to say that's what it is. That's my guess. That's what I think. I could be wrong. But many times, there may be some of you out there right now in a situation of waiting. And you're saying to yourself, how long, Lord? By the way, read the Psalms. Read David's. How many of the Psalms say, how long, Lord? How long before you take care of these enemies that are just killing me? For whatever reason, this is a part of God's plan for every one of us from time to time, including Elijah, right in the middle of his great success. There was a stop and a wait. And I think it's very, very important to us to realize that. So that when we do find ourselves in those situations, what do? Elijah, by the way, is a great example. I told you last week, he's had his greatest victory, but let me give you a clue. Right after his greatest victory, he's going to mess up. This isn't the time he's going to mess up. You're going to have to wait for that until next week. But what he does here is pretty awesome. He keeps praying. He keeps focused. He doesn't go into a rant. He just tells his servant, go back and check again. Go back and check again. And we get the idea he would have done this 20 times, or 50 times, or 100 times until the Lord answered. When you're in those positions of waiting, don't give up and stop seeking the Lord. Don't start thinking that God is not there, or he's not going to answer your prayer, or he's not going to resolve the situation, or he's not going to get you to where he wants to be. He will do it in his time. Keep praying. Keep believing. Keep knowing that in God's time it will happen. And know that even though you can't see it right now, you have no clue, God always has a reason when we have to wait. He's doing something you can't see, you are not aware of, that is perfect in his perfect will, just as he planned it. This is not a very significant part of the story, but it's there, and it's interesting. And we scratch our heads and go, what was that all about? What that was all about is yet another lesson for Elijah of who God is and what he's doing. And God isn't through with him. And God isn't through with you. So if you're waiting, don't give up hope. Keep praying. Keep seeking the Lord. And know that he's got you right where you're supposed to be. It's not time yet. When the time is right, the rains will come. And they will come in abundance. And by the way, here they did. They came in abundance. Verse 45, in a little while the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was with Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. Now this is interesting. Why is Elijah in such a hurry to beat Ahab to Jezreel? Well, let me remind you what just happened. Yahweh was just shown publicly in front of everyone to be the true God. The prophets of Baal were destroyed. But you know who wasn't there? Jezebel wasn't there. Nor were those 400 prophets of Asherah that eat at her table. They weren't there. This was not done yet. And I believe Elijah was going as fast as he could go by the power of the Lord. He beat Ahab because he wanted to witness Ahab coming in and informing Jezebel that Yahweh is the true God and all the prophets of Baal are dead. And by the way, your prophets of Asherah better get out of here too. He was coming to witness that. The grand conclusion when it was revealed to Jezebel and it was official, Yahweh was the king of Israel. But let me give you a hint. You can read ahead. It doesn't quite work out that way. There's going to be a surprise for Elijah. That's the preview of coming attractions. You have to come back next week to hear about that one.